Our next goal will be to investigate some of the controls that are provided for C# and XAML applications for building Metro-style applications. There are far too many to discuss them all here, and we'll focus on basic controls, new controls, or different XAML controls than you might have seen when building WPF or Silverlight applications. I took a snapshot of all of the XAML controls that you'll find built into Visual Studio, and at this point there are a lot of them, and there are some obvious omissions. You can examine the list at your leisure. You may find that the list is different by the time you install Visual Studio. In addition, there are a number of third-party control packages that will fill in some of the gaps in the list of controls that Microsoft has supplied. We're going to work through a simple example that Microsoft has provided, and we'll start by looking at the controls in the order they present them. Their example starts with progress controls. Microsoft provides two kinds of progress controls, including a progress ring, which looks something like this, although you can't really get an idea unless you see it in motion. It's a ring of dots that move in a circular fashion. It's a continuous, actually, ring-like set of dots, and it has an isActive property which controls whether or not those dots are moving. There's a progress bar control that looks like a horizontal bar of dots. At least that's one way to look at it. And the isIndeterminate property controls whether we see dots or an actual bar. If the isIndeterminate property is set to false, which means it's not indeterminate, the value property controls the length of the bar that we see, so we can actually control the length of the progress bar. If isIndeterminate is set to true, we just see the dots. This control has a show paused and show error property, which modifies the behavior of the progress bar. Let's investigate the basic control sample that Microsoft supplies and look at their example that includes the progress ring and progress bar controls. In order to find the samples that Microsoft supplies, I searched the web for the text Metro samples and ended up on this page. This page allows you to download all of those sample applications at once. If you don't want to download them all, you can back up to the samples link here in the breadcrumbs listed on the page, and this gives you an option to search for samples. I'll choose just C# samples and then search for basic controls. When I do that, I'll find the XAML Essential Controls sample and can select it and download that sample. Now I've already done that, and I'm running this sample here. This is that exact sample running as a Metro application, and you can see the first scenario is progress controls. Here we have the progress ring, here we have the progress bar. The progress ring has an isActive property. If I uncheck it, the progress ring is no longer active. If I check it, the progress ring becomes active again. Here we have a progress bar. I can choose whether or not this is indeterminate. If I uncheck this, it's no longer indeterminate, and now it appears as a bar. And if I set the value to, say, 5, you can see that we have 5% of that bar filled. Right now, the maximum value is 100, and for whatever reason, that's a little too big for my screen, and so I had to scroll to the right to see that 100 there. If I set this to 50, of course, it will fill up half of the bar. If I set this to indeterminate again, that value doesn't matter. It's just showing dots going from left to right. If I show it paused, then our progress bar is paused. If I show error, our progress bar shows an error. In other words, no value at all. So this is the SDK sample showing off essential controls, and we might want to see what it looks like in Visual Studio. So let me press Alt F4 to stop running and go back to Visual Studio where I've loaded that sample. Let's wait till it stops running. There we go. And go to the Solution Explorer. Here you can see this solution includes a number of different pages. We were just working with Scenario 1. Scenario 1 input is a page that just includes the information about what we're going to see. Here you can see a little text that describes the scenario. If we want to actually see the scenario, we go to Scenario 1 Output. Here we go. And this page includes markup for the controls we saw. The progress ring, let's get rid of the toolbox so we can see more, the progress ring, and over here the progress bar. If we look at the progress ring, it's interesting to see how they laid out these various properties. You can see for the progress ring, the isActive property of the progress ring has a binding set to the isChecked property of the active checkbox. That's how I can check or uncheck the checkbox and have it affect the progress ring. For the progress bar here, you can see that its value is set as a binding to the text property of the element whose name is value. And there's a converter involved here which converts from the string that I type to a double, which is what the progress bar expects. There's a show pause property, which is bound to the isChecked property of the paused checkbox. That was this. In any case, that's how these demos work. If you start investigating yourself, you may get confused by the layers of indirection and the way they've nested pages within other pages. But in any case, for this sample, if you want to investigate any one of the scenarios, look at the scenario output corresponding to the one you've selected in the demonstration. We were looking at Scenario 1, so we'll look at Scenario Output 1 in the sample project. You've seen so far the progress ring and the progress bar. Let's go back to our slides to examine the next set of basic controls we'll be looking at. To get started, we'll look at button controls. The button control looks something like this. It's a standard rectangular shape with text inside. Amazingly, it doesn't have to look like that at all. You can always change everything about each of these controls, but by default, that's what it looks like. It allows the user to click to make something happen, and the content property is the one that contains the text that you see. You handle the click event, as you've already seen, to make things happen when you click a button. There's a toggle switch control which looks something like this. You can supply some text, and users can toggle it on or off. Different pieces of text appear whether it's toggled on or off, and it has only those two states. It allows the user to select between two text values. The header property specifies the question, in this case, having fun yet. The on content specifies the on value, and the off content specifies the off value. There's also the standard checkbox control, which looks something like this. It allows the user to select multiple options. That is, if you have multiple checkbox controls, the user can select one or more of those checkboxes. And you can set the content property of the control to set the text. In this case, that would be checkbox content. The hyperlink button is a button that looks like a link. That's its claim to fame. It looks like a hyperlink, but has a click event like a button. There's a radio button, which is a circular shape, and this implies, and it's up to you and the user to understand, that you can only select one option from several. Whenever a user sees a radio button, the user should understand that there's only one available option. Selecting one deselects others. Let's look at these examples in Microsoft's Basic Controls sample. I have loaded the Microsoft Essential Controls sample again, and I'm running it here. And now we'll look at the button controls. And as you can see, a button is just a button. You can see I'm handling the click event by saying you clicked the button. Changing the content here to click me changes it in the button as well. And clearly you can imagine the markup. The content property of this control is bound to the text property of this text box. We don't need to look at the mechanism again. It's exactly the same as the previous demonstration that we saw. Here we have a toggle switch control, which can toggle between the values sure and nope. Here's the header text, and that could be something like, would you like fries with that? Not quite enough room to display all that, but you get the point. And here we could change this to no thanks, and the on content could be why not. And then you can see that's what the text looks like as we alter the state of that toggle switch. Here we have a checkbox, and again, the checkbox content determines what shows up here. And we could select, for example, a season of the year, summer. Once we check it, you can see the isChecked property is set. Now, this example doesn't allow me to change it here. We could definitely programmatically change the isChecked property, and I can bet you that if we look at the markup for this, this control's isChecked property is bound to the isChecked property of this control, but it's a one-way binding. So we can't change this one and affect this one. Could be two-way, and then it could go either way and prove the point. Here we have a hyperlink button, and we can change this one's content to be something like Microsoft.com, and clicking this indicates that we click the hyperlink button. We're just getting a click event, which we can do whatever we want with. Finally, we have a radio button down here, and it's not displaying correctly because of the scrolling required on this small screen real estate. But you can see we have a radio button that appears as a circle. We can change the text. It's hard to see, but believe me, we can by changing this. That says select me. Oh, there we go. And there's an isChecked property. I managed to get it to show a moment ago. I'm not sure how I did that. In any case, the isChecked property tells me whether it's selected or not. In the next example, we'll see a better use of the radio button control, actually allowing us to select one of several options. There we go. At least you can see everything there at once in our demonstration. These are simple button controls. You can investigate the markup if you like, but there's very little code involved here. It's just set up with binding, hooking up the examples to their controls that they control. Next, we'll look at some miscellaneous controls, starting with the combo box. This control allows you to add items in markup, in code, or by binding to a list source. It looks like a combo box that you might expect. The only difference is they attempt to center the items so the combo box both extends up and down, as opposed to a standard WPF or Silverlight combo box, which generally only extends down. You can react to the selection changed event to know when the user has changed the selected item, and that handler retrieves a collection called added items. That's a property of the event argument, and you use that to determine which item was selected. Now, the added items property contains a collection of selected items. For the combo box, there's only one allowed. But since all of this applies to a list box as well, the same mechanism can be used with a list box. The items in the list can be simple text in a text block, or they can be templated as well and can be anything you really want. You must cast the selected item to the correct type and then retrieve the appropriate value property of that type. You shouldn't count on always having text in a combo box or a list box. It may be that what you'll retrieve is a template which has a property for the thing you're trying to retrieve. And a list box works the same, except it might have multiple selected items. Our next control is a slider. The slider looks something like this and allows you to display a range of numeric values. You can set the minimum value and maximum value properties for your slider, and you can handle the value changed event if you need to do something every time the user changes the value of the slider. We used that in an earlier example in this course. In the samples you'll look at now, we won't be needing to handle the value changed event. You'll often find you can just bind to the value property of the slider and do something in that binding that hooks up what you need from the slider. An image control displays an image. You can control how the image control fills itself with the image. As you'll see, we have 4 options for this. You display an image by setting the source property to supply the image. You can set the stretch property to one of fill, which means the image will be resized to fill the dimensions of the container, and the aspect ratio may not be preserved if the container has different aspect ratio than the image itself. There's none, which preserves the original size, which means you may see just a tiny portion of the image in the image control. There's uniform, which means the image is resized to fit and it preserves the aspect ratio. You'll see the entire image, but it may not fill the entire image control because of the aspect ratio differences. And there's uniform to fill, which will resize the image to fill the image control, and it preserves the aspect ratio. And this one may clip the image because in one direction or another, the aspect ratios may not match up. You need to choose which one of these options you want to use for the stretch property of an image control. There's the tooltip control, which displays a tooltip as you right-click or hover your mouse over any other control. And it's unlike most other controls in that you use the tooltip service.tooltip property of the control where you want the tooltip to appear, and you set it to the desired text. So this becomes a property in this image you see of the image control itself. It's not a separate control you add. This is a service that you can attach to any control that supports tooltips. You can also set the tooltip service.placement property to control the placement of the tip, and you can choose bottom, left, right, or top, and also mouse, which puts the tooltip where the mouse is. You can hover over the control, in this case an image control, to see that tip. Now, we're treating a pop-up as a control, but it's really not. It's really a user control, which is handled specially. In order to create a pop-up, you add a user control to your project and add markup that defines what the pop-up looks like. In code, you have to create an instance of the pop-up class. You have to create an instance of your user control, and then set the child property of the pop-up you created to be the instance of your class that you created. You'll see code that does this in just a bit. Finally, you set the isOpen property of the pop-up to true to display the pop-up on the screen. You only need to take that action if isOpen is currently false, and our sample code does that. Let's stop and look at some of these sample controls as part of Microsoft's Essential Control sample. I've again loaded Microsoft's sample project, this time selecting scenario 3, miscellaneous controls. If I scroll down, you can see the various controls starting with the combo box. Here I can select an item, and once I do, it appears in the combo box and in this text block over here. I have a slider control here, and as I select a value, you can see it updates the value in the text block to the right. And I can't tell you without looking if it's handling the value changed event or if it's bound to that text block's text property. We'll have to look. I have an image here, and you can see that we have 4 options for how it stretches to fill. The fill option shows us the entire image within that image control, and it might rescale it to fit within the width and the height. None does no scaling and just shows us the portion that happens to fit within that image control, which I guess isn't very much of it. Uniform will scale it to fit the image control, but it may cause it to change the ratio between width and height. Uniform to fill will fill the control but may cause it to crop because the ratio of width and height might be different in the image than the image control. There's a tooltip applied to this image control. If I hover over the image, you'll see that tooltip appear. We'll look at the markup to see how that works. Finally, we have a pop-up. I click the Show Pop-up, and this UI shows up, and it stays up until we click the Close Pop-up button, which dismisses it. This time, we will need to look at the markup for this scenario. Let me close the application, go back to Visual Studio, and wait for the project to stop running. I'll choose Scenario Output 3 this time, and let's investigate to see what's going on for each of these controls. We first have here a combo box, and this one's really simple. It has within it 5 text blocks. There are lots of ways to get data into a combo box. This is the simplest. Just supply 5 text blocks, or whatever number of text blocks you need, and put values into them. You can see there is a selection changed event handler here. Let's navigate to the event handler to see what it's doing. This code takes E, which is the parameter passed to this event handler, gets its added items property. That's a collection of added items. We can retrieve the 0th item, and for a combo box, that's all there ever will be. The first item in the collection is the only one that matters. We cast that as a text block because we know this combo box contains a collection of text block objects. We retrieve the text property of that text block, and we put it into a text block which displays the output. This is here the text block that displays the output. We set the text property to be the text we get from that added items collection. Let's go back and look next then at the slider. Here's our slider. You can see its margin is set. It doesn't seem to have a maximum value or a minimum value set, so it by default goes between 0 and 100. It also doesn't have any code that hooks up its value changed event handler. Let's look at the code in the class behind this page to see if it hooks it up there. I pressed F7 to look at the code, and here in the constructor, there's no code that hooks that up. So I'll go back. And there must be something that's bound to that. And here it is right here. Here we have a text block, and its text is bound to the value property of an element whose name is slider1, and there is a converter that converts from a double back to a string. To be honest, I'm guessing the only reason that converter is there is to remove any extraneous decimal places. Because a slider has a value that is a double, it's going to have decimal places at the end of it. So this converter, double to string converter, which must be in this converters folder, here it is, just uses string.format to convert from a floating point value back to a string with no decimal places. We're not going to focus on building converters in this section. We did cover it in a prior section of this course. You're welcome to investigate that. But again, that's outside the scope of what we're covering here. Let's go back to our markup and look at the image. Here you see an image whose source is the images folder, image1.jpg. Let's look in the images folder. And here is our entire image. That's what it looks like. If we go back to our markup, you can see it's got a width and a height set. Its stretch by default is set to uniform to fill. And it also has a tooltip service.tooltip equals Oregon Coast and a tooltip service.placement equals right. So the tooltip appears to the right of the control. Now we also have here a stack panel that contains 4 radio buttons. Each one corresponds to one value of the stretch property of the image control. You can see that each one has content which represents what we see in the radio button, and each one calls stretch mode button underscore checked when it gets checked. Let's see how that code works. Here, based on the name of the button that you just selected, how do we get that button? You'll see that sender is an object. If we cast it as a radio button, we get a reference to the thing that was clicked. If image 1 isn't null, well, it better be not null, but we check just to make sure. Based on the button's name property, we set the stretch property of image 1 to be one of 4 different values. So it couldn't be much simpler than that. Next, we have our tooltip, which we already looked at, and we end with our pop-up. This is the most complex thing here. Okay, so we have a button whose text is show pop-up, and when you click it, we run pop-up button underscore click. Well, let's go to that code and see what it's doing. Okay, well, clearly there is a variable named pop-up defined somewhere else that's defined up here of type new pop-up. As I mentioned when talking on the slides, to create a pop-up, you create an instance of the pop-up class. They've done this here in a class level variable. So we have this variable pop-up, which refers to that new instance. We can't display it yet because we haven't told it what content to display. We need to say if the pop-up isn't currently open, then create a new instance of pop-up panel. Well, where is pop-up panel? There it is. Let's look at pop-up panel. Pop-up panel is this user control, which I added, or which you can add, by right-clicking on the project, choosing Add, New Item, and choosing User Control from the list of options here. We get a user control, and it's just a grid containing, they made it fancy with multiple borders, but it's just a bunch of markup. It doesn't really even do anything. There is a button down here that says Close Pop-up, and when you click it, we run the Close Pop-up code. Let's look at that code. It says, let's get a reference to the parent pop-up, and it does that by saying this.parent cast as a pop-up. We know it's a pop-up. Its parent is that user control. We'll get a reference to that, and we'll set the isOpen property to false. That closes the pop-up. That's what's required to close this pop-up region on the screen. Let's go back then to where we started here. Pop-up button underscore click, and we create a new instance of that user control. We indicate where we want it to appear on the screen, and then set the isOpen property to true. By setting the isOpen property, it displays that pop-up. Now remember, the steps are, first, create an instance of the pop-up class, which we did here. Then, create an instance of the user control that you want to display as a pop-up, and set that pop-up instance's child property to be your pop-up. Indicate where you want it. That's optional. If you don't, the system will decide where to put it. And finally, set the isOpen property of the pop-up to be true to display the pop-up containing the child which you assigned. So a pop-up isn't really its own control. It is a container for a user control, which you can display at any time, any place on the screen.